Welcome to Caregivers, Nourishment and Nurturing. This project was made possible by a grant from the Nova Scotia Department of Communities, Culture, Tourism and Heritage. Section 4. Why does feeding my person feel so challenging? Feeding someone as a caregiver is complex, more than it might appear on the surface. Trying to sort through the many ideas, questions, and suggestions arising about feeding your person can contribute to worry, anxiety, and distress. The intent of this section is that caregivers and those in their circle of care will recognize some of the reasons that feeding can feel challenging. Understanding why something feels challenging can often reduce distress and can help caregivers identify ways to manage their situation. In every household, eating and feeding roles, routines, responsibilities, and relationships are created over time. Generally, we're not aware of these until something happens to change them, as happens during caregiving. When this happens, these changes affect the eating of the caregiver, their person, and those in their circle of care. Let's think about feeding roles and responsibilities. Generally, in a household, there are two feeding roles, that of the feeder and that of those who eat what the feeder prepares. The feeder is responsible for getting food into the house, preparing and serving food. This person knows about all the food and cooking equipment in the house. They know what food is in cupboards, the refrigerator and freezer. They know what needs to get eaten before it spoils, and where all the equipment and utensils are to make a meal. Feeders, when they read of or hear a recipe that interests them, they know whether they have the ingredients in their home to make it. Of course, there's a wide variety in how feeding occurs in households. Feeding roles are often shared, as are tidying up, dealing with garbage, recycling, and composting. Changes in feeding roles and responsibilities that can happen with caregiving. In caregiving, the feeder role and responsibilities can change depending on who requires care. For a person who's had the feeder role and their person is now eating different than before, feeding routines change, both for them and their person. For a person who is new to the feeder role, there's a lot to learn about shopping and food preparation. Feeding and eating routines. Feeding and eating routines are what everyone in the household is familiar with in terms of what kinds of food are eaten, what time of day, where eating takes place, what dishes and utensils are used, how serving happens, whether or not people talk when they eat together, and how cleanup happens. Rituals are similar to routines, however they differ in the sense that there is greater intention with rituals. An example of this is how food is planned for, prepared, served, and eaten for special events or holidays. Everyone in a household is familiar with these rituals. Changes in eating and feeding routines and rituals that can happen with caregiving. When someone in a household cannot participate in the usual feeding routines, new ways to ensure that person stays nourished are required. For example, a person who starts to have difficulty swallowing requires food of a different texture. The person in the feeder role learns about possible foods to serve and may have to learn new food preparation skills. Food texture changes can be ongoing, so the feeder is constantly observing the person who's trying to eat to make sure the food that they have provided can be safely swallowed. The feeder and those in the circle of care are watchful that the care recipient doesn't choke. Sometimes a person also requires to be fed when they have difficulty getting a utensil to their mouth. This represents a lot of change from what was the usual eating and feeding routine for everyone in the household and the circle of care. For anyone new to the feeder role, they are learning about how to get food into the house, prepared, served, and for cleanup to happen, plus they are learning about how to prepare food of different textures. This is a lot to learn. If you are interested in speaking with a dietitian, please see Section 6. Another example is when a person is fed via feeding tube or syringe. The feeder creates a new routine to manage the tube or syringe feedings while feeding themselves and others in the home. Feeding relationships. The central relationship is that food is offered by one person, then accepted and eaten by another. In offering food, the message to the person who will eat is that you can trust me. This food is safe to eat and will not cause harm. In eating the food, the message is that of, I'll trust you. You have given me something safe to eat. This is a powerful relationship in that there's a shared yet unspoken understanding that the person offering food wants the person who will eat to go on living. By putting it into their body, the eater signals their trust that the feeder has provided food that will literally become them. Changes in feeding relationships that can happen with caregiving. These are often referred to as food fights. When a person has trouble eating, lacks an appetite, or when foods taste different or awful, feeding relationships are disrupted. Frustration can build on both sides. The person in the feeder role can feel hurt when their efforts to make and offer food do not result in their person eating. It can feel like a personal rejection, not just a rejection of the food. The person who is having trouble eating can feel food being pushed on them. It's important to recognize that in rejecting the food, they are not rejecting their caregiver. See Section 2 for feeding suggestions that might make eating easier for your person. This is a time when caregivers can seek the help of others to provide food for them so that they can focus on making food that will address their person's feeding challenges. Feeding as a caregiver is challenging because it disrupts feeding roles, routines, rituals, and relationships. Very often, these feeding challenges can come as a surprise, not something the caregiver planned for. This can happen for several reasons. When their person was receiving care, either in a hospital or in a clinic or a home visit, no feeding instructions were given, nor were eating and feeding discussed in planning for the care recipient to be at home. Thus, the caregiver discovers eating and feeding challenges or questions that arise as they are trying to settle into caregiving. Another thing that can happen is when diet information is provided, it can be too general or too complicated for the caregiving situation. Another thing that caregivers are reckoning with is that feeding responsibility is continual. It happens 3 or more times a day and very often changes from day to day or within a day. And both the caregiver and their care recipient experience grief at the loss of how eating previously took place.